Okay, so I have not yet adjusted your grade for that additional 10 points that I was supposed to award. I was kind of busy during the weekend. I'll do it today. So after today, your grade should be adjusted. So let us now go back to our chapter where I think the last topic that we were covering was this idea of a price floor. And the example that we were looking at was an agricultural price support program by the government, where government sets the minimum price for agricultural product to protect the producers. And sometimes this price floor is set above the market equilibrium price. And whenever there is a price floor in the market that is set above the market equilibrium price, we saw that it creates a deadweight loss equal to the area B and C. And we also argued that as a result of this price floor, there are going to be surplus production, which really does not get sold in the market. But in most of the cases, government really appropriates those surplus production from the market by providing some kind of subsidy or some kind of buyback guarantee. Regardless of how the government really, sort of designs their price control policy, price control policy is a price floor, and in this kind of price floor, we will have deadweight loss. Now, the issue of price floor is more controversial in the context of a labor market, where you can think about the labor market being in equilibrium at W1 wage rate and the market equilibrium quantity being L1, and suddenly the government imposes a minimum wage on the market, which is basically a price floor, and the minimum wage rate is set above the market equilibrium price, just like the price floor that we just looked at. At that minimum wage, you can see that the amount of supply of labor that is going to the market is L2, and the amount of demand for labor is L3. Remember, the demand curve in this market is coming from the producers, and the supply curve is coming from the household. This is a factor product market. Do you remember that? This is a market for factors of production. So it seems like at this minimum wage, there is more supply of labor than demand. This is going to create a surplus of labor in the market, which actually will create something called unemployment. Those of you who will take principles of macroeconomics after this, or have already taken principles of macroeconomics, will see or have already seen that unemployment is at the heart of any macroeconomic debate, especially for large countries like USA, where unemployment clearly dominates any other political discourse. It's a very serious issue. So when we look at minimum wage law, it is a very controversial topic in the sense that there are supporters of minimum wage law and there are critics of minimum wage law. The critics argue that the minimum wage is set above the market clearing wage of W1, and as a result, it creates unemployment in the economy. Just like what we just showed, that it creates this surplus labor in the market, which is equivalent to unemployment in a macroeconomic setup. The question that we are going to start today with is whether this argument is true or not. Is minimum wage rate above the market clearing wage of W1? Anyone? What do you think? Let's, for the sake of argument, believe that this is true, that the minimum wage rate is above the market clearing wage of W1 and there are jobs which would have accepted a wage rate of W1, but the government forces the producers to really pay minimum wage above the W1. What kind of jobs are we talking about here?
Low-skilled jobs.
Are we all clear that for jobs where the market clearing wage is lower than minimum wage is probably jobs that require very little skill? For a very low skill job, only for a very low skill job, you can argue that the minimum wage of $7 per hour is higher than what the market equilibrium wage would have been. Are we all clear on that? So if that is the argument, do we really have jobs in USA where the skill is so low that the market clearing wage would have been less than $7 per hour? One could make a strong argument and say no. In a country like USA, probably we don't have jobs like that unless, and what is that unless? What kind of jobs do you think, or what kind of sectors can you think about where, workers would be happy to receive less than $7 per hour? And the market would really clear.
Illegal workers.
Very good, very good. And for a more advanced course, we would talk about this illegal immigration as a sort of double-edged sword, like a topic that is very controversial, because on the policy side, on the politics side, illegal immigration is extremely unpopular, and you have seen this playing out in the recent presidential election landscape. But for a producer side, illegal immigration is good, right? Isn't that right? If you are a producer, would you really hate illegal immigrants? You would love them because you can pay them lower wage, right? Have we talked about Grapes of Wrath in the class? At least we mentioned the book. Okay, I sometimes forget that this is the principles of micro course. I'm a macroeconomist, and we're going to see a lot of macroeconomic element in the debate that we're having right now. So, Grapes of Wrath was written by John Steinbeck about the labor market consequences during the Great Depression, and Steinbeck makes a compelling case as how this kind of illegal immigration was welcomed by the producers back then. Of course, he was not really interested in cross-border illegal immigration or migration. He was mainly concerned about how people were moving from one state to another state and be willing to work at the lowest possible wage, right? So that's fascinating. So for a country like USA, minimum wage rate is clearly not above the market equilibrium wage. The argument can be made for countries like China or some poor countries where the skill level of the workers is substantially low, and only in those countries can this kind of figure make any sense. The only way we can rationalize arguing that minimum wage rate creates unemployment in USA is by coming up with sectors where the skill level is extremely low, and there are none. So that's the critic of minimum wage law. The supporters of minimum wage law argues that the minimum wage is probably set somewhere here at W star, which is below the market equilibrium wage. And they argue that if the minimum wage rate is set at W star, which is below the market equilibrium wage, what kind of effect does this price floor have on the economy? What kind of effect does W star has on the market? Okay, why? Because the market equilibrium wage rate is W1, and the minimum wage rate or the price floor is at W star, and that W star is irrelevant because the market is always clearing at W1. Are we all clear on that? So at W1 star, there is none or no effect So you now choose which makes sense to you, and make your own judgment about whether unemployment benefit or this kind of minimum wage rate law makes any sense or not. If you want to be absolutely fair, minimum wage law mainly stems from the normative side of the economics, where supporters of minimum wage law argues that for a developed country, the workers should have the freedom or right to receive certain amount of payment for their work, and that's where the minimum wage rate sort of came into a policy, basically in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Okay. So we are going to now look at some questions, one or two of them, just to give you an idea about the kind of questions that you might expect in the exam. And I will skip some questions. I'll skip some questions by pointing out the problem in those questions. They are provided by our publishers, and they have made some severe mistakes in some of these questions. For example, look at this question where I actually have added the word floor. If you have your slides, you will know that the word floor is not in your slide. Is it? You have the slides.
This question isn't on.
It should be.
Online.
Wow. We should talk about that. Okay. So let's look at the question. Okay, so the question is very much confusing. So it says after a price of $3.50 is imposed by the government. So how can the government impose a price of $3.50? That could be a price ceiling, that could be a price floor, right? Are we all clear on that? So if the government says that we are setting the price floor to $3.50. Sorry, let's start with the ceiling. So let's say the government says that $3.50 is a price ceiling. This is the maximum price that you can have in this market. Will that price ceiling have any effect on the market? The government says that the maximum price can be $3.50. Does it have any effect on the market? None. None. Price ceiling set above the market equilibrium has no effect on the market. So it has to be a floor, right? That's why this is a badly written question, because they don't mention about what the floor is. So now let's imagine that the price floor is at $3.50. If the price floor is $3.50, this is like the agricultural price support, right? And we know B and C are deadweight loss, right? What about A? What is A?
Consumer surplus is transferred to the producers.
Do we all see that? At the original market equilibrium price of $3, notice that A was part of the consumer surplus, right? It was part of this big triangle. Now the government comes in, imposes a price floor to protect our producers, right? So by imposing a price floor, government ensures that our producer gets a higher price, which means that our consumer pays a higher price, which means that part of the consumer surplus is lost and it becomes the gain of our producer. So area A is that area which used to be part of consumer surplus, now it is part of the producer surplus. Any question? So the answer is A. Let's look at the next question. This is a definitional question, and I have mentioned many times that definitional questions are going to be in the exam. Okay, so what's the correct answer? Anyone? You're right. The answer is B, right? We talked about this just right now, that if you have if you have a sector where the labor is so unskilled that minimum wage rate could really create unemployment. Let's look at A. Is minimum wage rate a price ceiling? What is minimum wage rate in the minimum wage in the market? It is actually a price floor. Very good. C. Many economies don't like the minimum wage but have yet to find alternative policies. Alternative policies to do what? I leave C and D for your consideration. I'm going to come back to this question in the next class, and I want your opinion on C and D. But the correct answer is B in this case. The next question is something like this, which is badly written. I have written that exclusively. So let's look at the question. So where do you think the rent control is? It's a very badly written question. Let's for the time being argue that the rent control is at $1,000, as the graph is suggesting. If the rent control is $1,000, does it have any effect on the market? Yes, it does, right? This is a rent control, which means that the government, this is like a price ceiling, right? This is exactly like the minimum, this is exactly the first example that we looked at in this chapter, where government sometimes imposes a price ceiling. So if there is a rent control of $1,000, the government is telling that the rent cannot be higher than $1,000. Okay, so if that is the case, what is the deadweight loss in this case? A, B, and C. So what happens when there is a deadweight loss, when there is a price ceiling like this rent control? We talked about having a rent control really affecting the market in several ways. First of all, we talked about this idea of a black market, right? So we talked about black market in the context that you will have black market premium where A and let's call the area D, two areas are going to be part of the black market activities. D is the area the consumer loses as a result of black market activities because they pay a higher premium for the existing apartments, and C is the loss of producer surplus that comes from the fact that our producer is now able to sell less, right? D and A are not deadweight loss. They are loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus, but they just change hands. Are we all clear on that? So the deadweight loss is actually B and C. Okay? So that's question number, by the way, do we all understand that? So the deadweight loss is just area B plus C. So the correct answer is C. This one is a badly written question because it doesn't really, it should have highlighted the area D, because area A is not the only part of laws that are coming from here. So I think this is also an unfortunate question. But this one is impossible. I'm just surprised by the amount of mistakes and sort of incompleteness these questions have. Please have the slides in front of you and mark this question as skip, and so that we are not gonna be asking this kind of questions in the exam. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm going to start the main discussion of today's class. And I want to go very slowly, although I'm running out of time very quickly. I didn't realize that we would be having this amount of discussion on this chapter, but this chapter is a challenging one. So far we have looked at the effect of government policy on price control and price floor and how it affects the market. Now we are going to look at the more important, more fundamental role of government, which is the role of government tax. How does the tax imposed by the government affect market equilibrium outcomes? We are going to look at two different kinds of taxes. One is when the government taxes the consumer, and the other one is when the government taxes the producer. We are going to see some really fascinating results today. First of all, we are going to see that regardless of who pays the tax, the amount of tax burden that the consumer and the producer pays are similar. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to first analyze the effect of government tax on the market by first looking at what happens when the tax is paid by a producer, and then look at what happens when the tax is paid by the consumer, and we're going to see that the effects are identical. And in that process, we are going to talk about something called tax incidence. Let me define that first. We are going to come back to this again so that we will talk about tax incidence twice. Let's look at the definition. The definition is a philosophical one. When we look at tax policy, we see that different sides of the market pays tax. Either the buyer is paying the tax because the tax is imposed on the buyer in the form of like a sales tax, or the tax is paid by the producer in the form of some kind of sales tax on the producer as well. Now, does that mean that whenever the tax is imposed on the consumer, that the consumer is actually paying the tax? Or does it mean that the tax is paid by the producer if the tax is imposed on the producer? The answer is no. The basic idea behind what we are talking about is that anytime there is a tax, it changes market equilibrium dynamics. It affects both sides of the market because equilibrium changes. The price that our consumer pays and the price that our producer receives fundamentally change whenever there is a tax. And that is going to be analyzed in the context of what we call tax incidence. Tax incidence really traces out who bears the effect of tax. Please understand that from a market perspective, tax is a burden, right? Tax is like you paying part of your profit to the government, or you pay part of your income to the government. Do we all see that? Tax, from a market perspective, is a burden. And we want to understand who bears the burden of this tax. Is it the consumer? Is it the producer? Or is it both? The answer is both of them pays the burden of the tax. In order to clearly understand that, we are going to start with the tax on the producer side. Before we do that, we want to make sure that we understand that the main discussion of today is going to be that we are going to always think about per unit tax in this course. Examples of per unit tax are sales tax, excise tax, customs duty, but then there are other kind of taxes which are on a percentage basis, such as your income tax, such as your corporate profit tax, which are mainly macro concept, and your principles of macroeconomics, we'll talk about them. So the kind of tax that we are looking at is basically like a gasoline tax that was imposed in US economy starting from 2013. The first example that we're going to look at is a situation where the tax is imposed on the producer, which means that government at the end of the year collects that tax from the producer. How does the government do that? How does the government collect tax from the producer? This is a fairly important question, by the way. And I apologize, I'm asking this question in the wrong class. This is basically a macro question, but I'm a macroeconomist. I simply cannot help but ask this kind of questions. But I want to give you guys an idea too, right? How do you think the government collects this tax from the producer? Yes?
Income taxes?
Well, firms, producers don't pay income tax. Income tax is for consumers. Right? So when you file a tax, you file tax as a household. And household is not a firm, right? Household is not a producer. What the producer pays is called profit tax or corporate profit tax, which is not what we're talking about here. Corporate profit tax is a percentage tax which we are ignoring. What we are talking about here is a tax that a producer pays on a unit basis, right? So at the end of the year, our producer submits all their sales to an audit company or an audit agency or to HR block, and they figure out how much tax our producer should be paying to the government. Make sense? Okay. These are examples of sales tax. Sometimes sales tax could be more explicit, like the one that we are looking at. The one that we're going to look at is an example of a tax on cigarettes, where when you pay, when you pay for your cigarettes, you will see that there is a price that you pay for your cigarettes, and there is something called an excise tax or a sales tax on that particular item, because government wants to discourage the consumption of cigarettes. So what the government has done, government has imposed a tax, and the tax actually has a very unique name. It is called sin tax. Sin tax. You get the picture, right? It is very interesting. There is a sort of like a biblical interpretation of that. Alcoholic beverages also have the same so-called sin tax. Okay, but the idea is to discourage people from buying that. But nevertheless, this is a tax which is imposed on the producer. What does the producer do? Does he pay that all by himself? No. What he's going to do, he's going to make the consumer pay for that, because it's the consumer who is buying that. That's where the idea of tax incidence comes from. That regardless of who pays the tax, the burden of tax is borne by both sides of the market. Let's go a couple of steps back and ask ourselves what happens when the government imposes this tax on the producer. There are various ways to think about how taxes affect the buyer side and the seller side of this market. In this Principles of Microeconomics course, we want to maintain a very strict interpretation of the effect of tax. A very strict interpretation. Without that, you're going to run into all sorts of problems. We're going to assume that a tax on the producer is like an increase in his cost of production. We are going to think about a tax on the producer as if the cost of the production of the producer is going up. If that is the case, then a tax on the producer really causes a shift, leftward shift of the supply curve, just like an increase in the cost of production would. Does it make sense? Does it make sense that a tax, if interpreted as an increase in cost of production, would shift the supply curve to the left? It is extremely important that we understand these movements in the market as a result of tax, without which we will not understand the idea of tax incidence. And I can assure you that these are going to be in your exam. So please, if you have any question, stop me and ask questions right now. Okay, so we are going to look at a tax on the producer where before the tax imposition, the market equilibrium was at point A, market equilibrium price was 5, market equilibrium quantity was 4. 4 is in billions, it's irrelevant. So now the government imposes a tax of just $1. $1 tax. $1 tax on every item that our producer is selling. So if our producer sells 4 billion packets of cigarettes, our producer has to pay $1 extra for every pack of cigarettes they are selling in the market. Which means that with this $1 tax, and our producer willing to sell 4 billion units of cigarettes, their supply, the price that they have to charge to the consumer is 5 plus $1, $6. Make sense? The graphical interpretation is that if this $1 tax is imposed, the amount of tax, this $1 tax is going to shift our supply curve up, and the amount of shift of supply curve is exactly $1. As a result of a $1 tax on the producer, our supply curve shifts to the left, and the vertical distance between the old supply curve S1 and the new supply curve S2 is $1, measured by the vertical distance. Are we all clear on this? Let's now look at some interesting results. As the supply curve shifts to the left by the amount of $1, let us now figure out how much tax our consumer is paying and how much tax our producer is paying, because both of them are paying part of the tax burden. Let's start with our consumer. Before the tax, our consumer was really paying $5. Now, our consumer pays $5.90. Do we all see that? Before the tax, our consumer was paying $5. Now our consumer pays $5.90. So 90 cents is paid. So out of the $1 tax that our consumer, that the government has imposed, our consumer pays 90 cents. Do we all see that? For future discussion, I will always refer to P1 as the price that our consumer pays in the market. So our consumer pays $5.90. How much does our producer receive? Our consumer in this market pays $5.90. How much does our producer receive? It seems like a trivial question. It is not, right? Why? Because in a regular market where we were thinking about the market as a table where there is a buyer and there is a seller, the producer always receives what the seller pays, right? But now we have a problem. We have a government here, right? And when the consumer is paying $5.90, our producer is taking that $5.90 and giving $1 back to the government. Do we all see that? Does it make sense? So our producer really receives $4.90. Our consumer pays $5.90. Our producer receives $4.90. Our consumer pays 90 cent burden by our consumer. So our 90 cent is the consumer burden. And for the producer side, notice that before the market equilibrium, before the tax, our producers were receiving $5. Now they receive $4.90. So our producers really pay only 10 cents of the burden. Do we all see that? So this is fascinating. Let's summarize what we have just covered. The government imposed a $1 tax on the producer, shifted the supply curve to the left equal to the amount of tax. Equilibrium price increased to $5.90. Equilibrium quantity went down. Out of the $1 tax, our consumer pays 90 cents worth of tax burden. Our producer pays only 10 cents. So although the tax is imposed on the producer, our producer ends up paying less of the tax burden. Notice that out of the $1, 90% of the tax burden is borne by the consumer, 10% of the tax burden is borne by the producer. The shaded area that you are looking at is important. The shaded area is what we call the tax revenue by the government. What is the tax revenue? So let's ignore some of these. Okay, so the tax revenue is a rectangle. The rectangle where the height is the amount of tax the government receives, which is $1, times the amount of goods that our producer sells, which is 3.7 billion packets of cigarettes. For every of those cigarette packets, our producer pays $1. So this entire rectangle measures the amount of tax revenue collected by the government. Do we all see that? Now, we have to be really careful about interpreting this tax revenue. If you pay attention, you would realize that part of this government tax revenue used to be consumer surplus, right? Especially this part used to be consumer surplus before the tax, right? Do you see that? And this part used to be producer surplus before tax. This is loss of consumer surplus, and the lower rectangle is the loss of producer surplus. But now these are becoming part of the government tax revenue. So they're really not loss, they are just losses of consumer surplus and producer surplus accumulated by the government by tax revenue. In this sense, this is very much similar to the price floor and the price ceiling effect. Do you all see that? In the price floor and the price ceiling effect, the loss in consumer surplus became the gain of producer surplus, and the loss of producer surplus became the gain of the consumer surplus. So there was a sharing of the losses. Here, what is loss of the consumer and the producer becomes the gain of the government. Despite government collecting part of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus, we still see that there are two areas where there is a loss from the society's perspective. The first one is the upper rectangle, which is loss of consumer surplus that is not covered by the government, and there is also another rectangle, which is the lower rectangle, which is the loss of producer surplus from the society's perspective, and they together constitute the deadweight loss of a tax imposed on the producer side. So, just like the price floor and the price ceiling, a tax policy creates deadweight loss in the market. Any question? So, let us summarize. The government imposed a tax on the producer by $1, caused suppliers to shift their supply curve to the left, caused equilibrium price to go up, caused equilibrium quantity to go down, caused our consumer to bear a larger fraction of the tax burden than the producer. So the question is why? How come when the producers are paying tax, our consumers end up paying the larger burden of the tax? Are we all clear on the question? We are going to answer this why question in two steps. One step we are going to be able to cover today. The next one is what we are going to cover in the next class. What we are going to do now is we are going to think about a tax now imposed on the consumer side. Imposed on the consumer side. It's a slightly different example. The example is in cents rather than dollars, but stay with me, this is identical example. I am skipping one example which is in your slides, and it is very important that you go over that one by yourself. It is an example where the government imposes a tax on your gasoline paid by the producer, which is identical to what we have just covered. If you do that, if you analyze this effect of a tax imposed on the gasoline price and paid by the producer, you're going to see that there is also 80-20% split of tax burden between the consumer and the producer. So in this case also our consumer pays a larger burden of the tax. The example that I want to go over is a tax imposed on the consumer side. And I want to warn you that the way they have explained the effect of tax burden on the consumer is not a convincing one. This is a fairly poorly written explanation. So we want to first understand, so for the producer side, we assume that increase in tax by the government on the producer should be thought of as an increase in cost of production. It kind of makes sense, right? Are we all clear on that? How do you interpret the effect of a tax on the consumer? How does the consumer look at the tax? There are two ways to think about tax and how it affects our consumers. One could be that the tax is imposed on his income, so whenever there is a tax, his income goes down, and we know how an increase in tax causes a decrease in income, so demand curve shifts to the left, right? Makes sense. But that would be an example of a tax which is percentage basis, right? Are we all clear? Are we clear on that? And we are not talking about that percentage change in tax. We're talking about per unit tax. So how would you, what the alternative way to think about tax, and this is a little bit stretching the truth. So please stay with me. So imagine that there are 3 or 4 different kinds of gasoline that you are buying from the market, and the government imposes tax on one of them. So if there's a tax on one of them, imposition of tax on that good could be like an increase in price for that good. How would you respond? How does your demand response to? I just realized that this also doesn't make any sense. Okay, so let's just assume that, let's just make an assumption, and we are going to stick with that, because I guess that's the only way we can rationalize this. We're going to say that just like the producer, a tax on the consumer reduces their demand. Not quantity demanded, but demand. Just like a tax on the producer reduces their supply, so supply curve shifted to the left. A tax on the consumer is going to shift their demand, meaning that demand also shifts to the left. Are we all clear on the assumption? Please write it down so that you do not run into confusion about this. Okay, so the same argument, the same example, before equilibrium, before tax, the market equilibrium was $3.50. The government imposes a 10-cent tax per gallon of whatever they are buying, right? 10-cent tax is going to shift our demand down. Demand curve shifts from D1 to D2, so the difference between the shift, the vertical difference between D1 and D2 is 10 cents. So the vertical difference between them is 10 cents. Okay? So the demand shifts to the left. Obviously, you now have a new equilibrium. The new equilibrium is at where the new demand curve intersects the old supply curve. Let us now move on and try to figure out what our consumer pays and what our producer receives, just like the previous one. So at the new equilibrium, notice that our producer receives $3.48. So this is P2, right? P2 is always the price that our producer receives. So what the consumer is doing, our consumer is paying $3.48 to the government, to the producer, and then they're paying this 10 extra cent to the government. So our consumer actually is paying $3.58. So that's P1. Please take a moment to clearly understand what is P1 and what is P2. This is a tax which is imposed on the consumer, which means that consumer, in addition to paying for the good from the producer, also pays a fraction of the purchase to the government. Right? Are we all clear on this? So our consumer pays $3.48 to the producer and then pays